The gifts had been arriving for 3 days. Smoked meats from the Duskwall pack, pelts from the Greyvein Highlands, a carved obsidian wolf head from the Norath borderlands, heavy enough that it took 2 men to carry it into Ironreach Hall and set it at the foot of the throne. Zuran Maddock had not looked at any of it. He stood at the narrow window of his war room, with his back to the room, watching the tree line beyond the outer wall, the way a man watches something he expects to attack him. His commanders had stopped trying to engage him in conversation 2 hours ago. They knew that stillness. They'd seen it before battles. This was not a battle. This was worse. The Halvari pack had sent a representative, a healer, not a blood-sworn pledge, not a warrior second, not even a council elder, a healer. The insult was so precise it was almost elegant. Halvari was telling him, without a single spoken word, exactly how much they feared him. Not at all. Commander Tailvorn cleared his throat. She arrived at the eastern gate an hour ago. The escort said she walked most of the way from the Halvari border on foot. Her horse threw a shoe 2 days out. Zuran said nothing. She's been waiting in the outer hall. She hasn't asked for food or water. She did ask one of the gate sentinels if we had a sharpening stone because her belt knife needed work. Someone in the room made a sound that was almost a laugh and immediately died. Zuran turned from the window. He was not a large man in the way stories describe kings. Not broad for show, not tall for ceremony. He was built the way something built for endurance is built, efficiently, without waste, with a quality of stillness that made rooms feel smaller when he entered them. The scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw was old enough to have gone silver. His eyes were the particular grey of weather before it makes a decision. "Bring her in," he said. The doors opened. She walked through them the way someone walks through their own front door, not hurried, not performing, simply moving from one place to another with the expectation that she had every right to be there. She was travel-worn in a way she hadn't bothered to hide. Her coat had road dust on the shoulders. Her boots were the practical, ugly kind built for distance. There was a bandage on her left forearm that she'd applied herself, efficiently, without much care for neatness. She stopped 6 feet from the throne and looked at him. Not up at him. Directly at him. Like she was taking his measure and hadn't finished yet. One of her bootlaces was undone. She either hadn't noticed or didn't care. He noticed. He did not know why he crossed the room. He would think about it later, standing at that same window, long after everyone had gone, and he still would not have a satisfying answer. He knew only that something about the undone lace, against the straight spine and the direct eyes and the dust on the shoulders, produced in him a reaction that bypassed his usual architecture of restraint entirely. He crouched. He tied the lace. He stood. The silence in the great hall had a texture. She looked down at her boot, then back at him. Her expression did not change, but something moved behind her eyes. Surprise, swiftly sealed over, like a door shut before a draft could get in. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was even. Not grateful, not hostile. Simply acknowledging a fact. He walked back to his throne and sat, and every commander in that room looked at each other with expressions that said, collectively, "What just happened?" And none of them dared ask. Her name is Fane. She had been sent to Ironreach as a diplomatic courtesy, which was to say, as nothing, as a gesture, as a way for the Halvari pack to appear cooperative while giving up absolutely nothing of value. She knew it. He knew it. Everyone in the room knew it. What no one knew, not yet, was what she carried in the worn leather satchel on her back. Not medicines. Not diplomatic papers. Something that would make 3 packs go to war over a woman who had arrived on foot with a dull knife and 1 undone boot. Something she had been transporting alone, in secret, for 11 days. And the man who had just tied her shoe was the only person in this territory who could decide whether it destroyed her or saved her. Chapter 1. The Halvari pack master had not said it directly. Men like him rarely did. He had called it an honor, a diplomatic gesture, an opportunity for a healer of Fane's experience to represent Halvari interests at Ironreach, the most fortified pack stronghold on the continent, ruled by a king whose name other pack leaders said quietly, the way you say the name of something you'd rather not attract. Fane had listened to the whole speech. She had nodded at the appropriate moments. And when the packmaster finished, she had said simply, "When do I leave?" Because there was no point naming what they both understood. He was sending her because she was good enough to appear credible and unimportant enough to lose. She had her own reasons for going. She kept them to herself. The escort lasted 4 days. On the 5th morning, her horse threw a shoe on a frozen ridge road, 2 days' ride from the Ironreach eastern gate, and the 2 sentinels assigned to accompany her exchanged a look she was not meant to see. One of them said they would ride ahead and arrange a replacement mount to be sent back. Neither of them returned. Fane stood on the ridge for a moment, hand on her horse's neck, watching them disappear into the tree line. The cold was the particular kind that settles into the joints. Her satchel was heavy. The road was empty in both directions. She adjusted the strap across her shoulder, told the horse she was sorry, tied it to a branch with enough slack to graze, and walked. It took the better part of 2 days. She arrived at the Ironreach eastern gate in the late afternoon of the 7th day, road dust on her coat, boots that had done more work than they were built for, and a belt knife that had been dull since the 3rd day and was getting worse. The gate sentinel looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. "Is there a sharpening stone in this stronghold?" she said, "or do I have to ask nicely?" They kept her waiting in the outer hall for 40 minutes. She used the time productively, memorizing the guard rotation, counting all the torches, noting which corridor carried the most foot traffic and which direction the kitchen smells came from. Old habit. She did it the way other people breathe, without deciding to. The Great Hall of Ironreach was nothing like the stories. Stories gave it grandeur. What it actually had was weight. Stone walls thick enough to absorb sound, a ceiling high enough to let heat escape, and the particular atmosphere of a room where serious things had been decided for a very long time. There were no decorations that weren't functional. The banners on the walls were faded from actual weather, not ceremonial display. Fane walked in the way she walked into most rooms, like she had already decided she belonged there, and was simply confirming it. There were 7 men inside, commanders, by their positioning. They arranged themselves the way men do when they want to appear casual, and are not. At the far end of the room stood the man she had come to see. She had heard descriptions of Zur and Madek. None of them had been wrong exactly, but none had captured the particular quality of stillness he carried, the kind that doesn't come from calm, but from restraint, from years of choosing not to move when movement was possible. The scar along his jaw was older than she expected. His eyes found her immediately and stayed there, not as an intimidation tactic, but as simple assessment. She assessed him back. She had crossed maybe 15 feet of stone floor when her left boot caught. The lace, loose since the 2nd day of walking, finally giving up entirely. She didn't stumble. She registered it, adjusted her weight, kept moving. She stopped 6 feet from him and held his gaze. For a moment, nothing happened. Then he moved. He crossed the room in a few unhurried strides, crouched in front of her with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man performing a task, and tied the lace. Not quickly, not slowly, simply thoroughly. He stood. The hall was completely silent. Fane looked down at her boot, then at him. His expression gave her nothing. Hers, she made certain, gave him nothing either. "Thank you," she said. He walked back to the far end of the room and stood where he had been standing. Someone behind her made a sound that wasn't quite a cough. Neither of them referenced it again. The room they gave her was on the 3rd level of the eastern wing. Stone walls, 1 window, a bed with 2 blankets, a table with a candle. Functional. Cold in the way buildings are cold when they haven't decided yet whether you're staying. The sentinel who showed her up was young and trying not to stare. He told her the morning meal was at dawn, that the east corridor was restricted after dark, and that someone would bring water. She thanked him and waited until his footsteps faded down the stairs. Then she set her satchel on the table without opening it, and stood in the center of the room. 1 door, 1 window, 3rd level, drop survivable but not clean. The corridor outside had 2 sentinels at the far end, rotating on what sounded like a 4-hour pattern. The east corridor restriction was interesting. Most restrictions were. She checked the door latch, noted the gap under it, tried the window and confirmed it opened fully, which most people forgot to confirm. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her satchel. Inside, it was the reason she had taken an assignment designed to be an insult, walked 2 days on a frozen road, and tied her own lace every morning, knowing it would come undone before noon. She had not come to Ironreach as a diplomatic gesture. She had come because people had died, and the answer to why was somewhere inside these walls, and no one else was going to find it. She did not unpack. Chapter 2. The candle had burned down to a stub by the time Fane finally opened the satchel. She did not do it carelessly. She moved the table against the wall first, angled so that anyone opening the door would see her back before they saw what was in front of her. Then she sat, pulled the satchel onto her lap, and undid the 2 clasps slowly, not from hesitation, but from the habit of a woman who had learned that careful hands made fewer mistakes than urgent ones. The sealed record was at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth and bound with a cord she had knotted herself. She set it on the table without unwrapping it. She already knew what was inside. She had read it so many times over the past 11 days that she could have recited it in the dark. 41 people across 2 border settlements, Halvari side of the line, a farming outpost called Wren's Crossing, and a smaller cluster of homes the maps didn't bother to name. The contagion had moved through both within the span of 3 weeks, 14 months ago. Fever first, then the joints, then, in the cases that didn't survive, the lungs. 17 of the 41 had not survived. Fane had treated 6 of them personally. She had been stationed at a Halvari field post 2 hours' ride from Wren's Crossing when the first reports came in. By the time she arrived, the settlement healer had already lost 2. By the time it was over, she had not slept in 4 days and had run out of the one compound that seemed to slow the fever's progression. She had gone back afterward, the way she always went back. Not because anyone asked her to, because 17 people deserved to have someone ask why. The water source was a shared runoff channel that fed from the higher ground on the Ironreach side of the border. Fane had found trace contamination markers consistent with a compromised upstream source, indicators that didn't appear naturally, that required either significant negligence in waste management or something more deliberate. She didn't know which yet. That distinction mattered enormously to her. It would determine what she did next. She wrapped the record back in its oilcloth, returned it to the satchel, and sat in the quiet for a moment. Somewhere below, the stronghold settled into its nighttime rhythms. Distant footsteps, a door, the low exchange of sentinels changing position. She had not told the Halvari packmaster what she found. She had told him only that the contagion's origin required further investigation on Iron Reach territory. He had seen a diplomatic opportunity and taken it, which was exactly what she had calculated he would do. She had used him the same way he had used her. She blew out the candle and lay down without undressing. 3 floors below, in a room lit by considerably more candles, Commander Tail Vaughan set a thin folder on the table and looked at his king. Zuran had not sat down. He stood at the edge of the candlelight with his arms crossed, which Tael had learned over 12 years, meant he was listening more carefully than he appeared to be. "She's a senior field healer," Tael said. 12 years with Halvari's mobile medical units. Before that, 2 years at a neutral border post the Halvari Pack funds, but doesn't formally claim. No Pack Council affiliations, no recorded alliances with any of the border families. No disciplinary record. No commendations either. Not because the work wasn't done, but because field healers at her level tend to work in places where there's no one senior enough to issue them. He paused. She has a reputation. Difficult to work with. Doesn't observe rank protocol in medical situations. 3 separate incident reports from senior Pack officers, all saying variations of the same thing, that she overruled their decisions in the field and was correct every time, which somehow made it worse. Zuran said nothing. "I can't find a reason Halvari sent her specifically," Tael continued. "If they wanted a credible diplomatic gesture, there are 3 senior Halvari healers with more formal standing. If they wanted someone politically useful, she has no political connections to be useful with. She doesn't appear to know anyone here. She has no obvious interest in Iron Reach beyond the assignment." He closed the folder. "She's clean. As far as I can find, she is exactly what she appears to be." The silence stretched long enough that Tael began to consider whether the meeting was over. "What does she appear to be?" Zuran said. Tael considered the question with the care it seemed to require. Someone very good at a difficult job who was sent here because her pack master didn't know what else to do with her. Zuran looked at the folder without picking it up. Something moved behind his expression. Not doubt, not suspicion. Something closer to the particular unease of a man who has looked for the shape of a thing and found it doesn't have one. People without angles were harder to read than people with them. He knew how to account for agenda. He had no mechanism for accounting for someone who simply appeared to have none. "Keep watching," he said. Tael nodded once and gathered the folder. At the door he paused. "She asked the kitchen this morning if they had dried yarrow root. When the cook said no, she asked if anyone had noted what grew along the eastern wall near the drainage channel. Apparently something does." Zuran waited. The cook said she spent 20 minutes out there before the morning meal. Came back with her hands dirty and something wrapped in her kerchief. Tael's expression was carefully neutral. "She's cataloguing the local medicinal plants in case she needs them." The door closed. Zuran stood alone in the candlelight for a moment. Then he moved to the window and looked out at the eastern wall, dark now. Nothing visible. A woman who walked 2 days on a frozen road arrived without complaint and spent her first free morning learning what this land could offer her if she needed it. He didn't know what to do with that either. Chapter 3. The formal dinner was Tael's idea. He had framed it as protocol, a courtesy extended to all diplomatic representatives, which technically Fane was, regardless of how she had arrived or what she had arrived without. Zoran had looked at him for a long moment, recognized the suggestion for what it was, an attempt to put the two of them in a controlled setting and see what happened, and agreed, because refusing would have been its own kind of information. The dining room used for such occasions was smaller than the great hall and more honestly lit. A long table that could seat 20 held only 2 settings tonight, positioned at one end with the practical acknowledgement that seating them at opposite ends would have been absurd. A fire, 4 candles, 2 sentinels outside the door who were absolutely not listening. Fane arrived exactly on time, which Zoran noted because most people arrived early to diplomatic dinners, to establish presence, to arrange themselves, to be seen already settled when the other party entered. She wore the same coat she had arrived in, brushed clean. Her hair was pulled back with the efficiency of someone who had solved that particular problem and moved on. She sat without waiting to be invited to sit. He sat across from her. For a while, there was only the sound of the meal being served, and the fire doing what fires do. Zoran had governed long enough to be comfortable with silence. He used it the way some men used words, deliberately to see what the other person did inside it. Fane, it turned out, was also comfortable with silence. She ate with the focused attention of someone who had spent years eating quickly in difficult conditions and had not entirely lost the habit. She looked at the room the way she had looked at him in the great hall, assessing, unhurried, without the performance of not looking. It was Zoran who spoke first, which was unusual enough that he registered it. "How long were you at the neutral border post?" She looked up. 2 years. Halvari funding, no Halvari oversight. That's what neutral means. He waited to see if she would ask how he knew. She didn't. She returned to her meal with the equanimity of a woman who had assumed she was being studied and had no particular objection to it. "What made you leave?" he said. She considered the question with more honesty than he expected. The work changed. When a post gets stable enough, it stops needing a field healer and starts needing an administrator. I'm not an administrator. What's the difference? She set down her fork. An administrator manages systems. A field healer manages what the system missed. A beat. Most of what I treat has already been through a system that didn't catch it in time. Something in the framing snagged his attention. That sounds like an argument against systems, he said. It's an argument for humility about what systems can do. Her voice was even, not combative. A system tells you what should happen. It doesn't tell you what to do when it doesn't. Without systems, Zoran said, you have individuals making decisions with incomplete information and no accountability. With rigid systems, Fane said, you have structures that protect themselves instead of the people they were built for. The dinner had become an argument without either of them deciding it should. Zoran noticed this and continued anyway. I've seen what happens to packs without strong governance. It isn't freedom. It's whoever is most willing to hurt people first. I'm not arguing against governance. Fane's eyes were steady. I'm arguing against confusing control with safety. They're not the same thing. Control is what you can see and measure. Safety is what actually happens to people. She paused. Sometimes those align. Sometimes the thing being controlled is the information that something isn't safe. The room was quiet for a moment. Zoran looked at her across the table. She looked back without adjusting her expression for his benefit, without softening the point or adding reassurance around it. She had said the thing she thought was true, and she was waiting to see what he did with it. He found it, not comfortable exactly, but honest in a way that most dinner conversation inside these walls had stopped being years ago. People talked to him carefully. They shaped what they said around what they believed he wanted to hear, which meant he spent most conversations accounting for the distance between what was said and what was meant. Fane appeared to have no such distance. He thought she was reckless, a healer who operated outside formal structures, who trusted her own assessment over established protocol, who had walked into a foreign stronghold with no political backing, and apparently no concern about what that exposed her to. That kind of confidence was one bad judgment from disaster. She thought, he could see it, she wasn't hiding it, that he had spent so long building structures to keep things predictable that he had started to mistake the structure for the safety it was meant to provide, that the control he maintained was as much about managing his own uncertainty as it was about governing effectively. They were both partially right. Neither of them said so. The meal ended without resolution, which was also, Zuren suspected, honest. Fane stood when it was finished and picked up her coat from the back of the chair with the same lack of ceremony with which she had arrived. At the door she paused, not for effect, but as though something had occurred to her. "The drainage channel on the eastern wall," she said. "The one near the kitchen garden. When was it last inspected?" He looked at her. "Why?" "The yarrow growing beside it is healthy. The clover 2 feet closer to the wall isn't." She said it the way she said most things, plainly, without drama, leaving the implication for him to collect. "Probably nothing." She left. Zuren sat alone at the table for longer than he intended. Outside, the fire settled. The candles held. He thought about the clover. He thought about what she had said. Control is not the same as safety. And the particular quality of discomfort the sentence produced, which was the discomfort of something that contained enough truth to require sitting with, rather than dismissing. He did not call for Tile. He stayed with it alone, the way he stayed with most things. That, too, was a kind of answer. Chapter 4. The archivist said no twice. The first time, Fane had asked directly, introduced herself, stated her role, explained that she was a senior field healer with a clinical interest in regional water source management as it related to contagion patterns. A reasonable request. A professional one. The archivist, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, and the particular rigidity of someone who had organized the same system for many years and did not intend to have it disturbed, told her the medical archive was restricted to Iron Reach administrative personnel. Fane thanked him and left. She came back the following morning and asked again, this time framing it as a courtesy review. Standard practice, she said, when a healer moved between pack territories. A way of understanding local medical history to avoid duplicating work already done. She kept her voice pleasant and her expression open. He said no again, more firmly, and with the addition of a comment about proper channels and formal requests submitted in writing to the territorial warden's office. Fane thanked him again. She spent the rest of that morning thinking about the word proportionate. A routine clinical inquiry, declined twice without explanation. The archive existed to hold records. Records existed to be referenced. The refusal was not proportionate to the request, unless the request was closer to something sensitive than it appeared. That afternoon, while the archivist took his midday meal, she went in anyway. She had noted the archive's location on her second day. A ground-level room off the eastern administrative corridor. Stone door, iron latch. No lock beyond the latch itself. The kind of security that worked on the assumption that the instruction not to enter would be sufficient. It took her 4 minutes to find the regional water source files. They were organized by territory and year, which was logical, and she moved through them with the efficiency of a woman who had spent years reading medical documentation under poor lighting in difficult circumstances. The file for the southern border channel, the shared runoff that fed from Iron Reach high ground into the Halvari settlements, was present 14 months ago. She pulled it and carried it to the narrow window where the light was better. She read it twice. The first read was for information. The second was because she needed to be certain she had understood correctly. The report was a water source management assessment, flagged internally by an Iron Reach territorial inspector. The flagging notation was brief but clear. Upstream contamination indicators detected. Recommend immediate source closure and downstream alert. Below the notation was a second entry, added 4 days later in different handwriting. Reviewed. Monitoring assigned. Further action pending assessment. Below that, nothing. The file ended. No closure order. No downstream alert. No record of the monitoring that had been assigned or what it had found. 14 months ago, 3 weeks after that second notation, the first cases appeared at Wren's Crossing. Fane stood at the window for a long time. Someone at Iron Reach had known, not suspected, known, with enough certainty to flag the file and recommend immediate action. And then someone else had reviewed that recommendation, noted it, assigned a monitoring task that produced no documented outcome, and left it. 17 people. She had held 2 of them while they died. An older man who kept apologizing for the inconvenience. A young woman who had asked Fane, with complete sincerity, whether she was going to be all right. And Fane had said, "I'm doing everything I can," which was true, and was not the same as yes. She pressed the bridge of her nose with 2 fingers. It was a thing she did when she needed to stay functional instead of feeling, which was a habit she had developed early and relied on more than she would have chosen to. The question she had carried for 14 months had not been answered. It had subdivided. Someone knew. Someone else reviewed it and did not act. Were they the same person? Were they connected? Was the failure administrative? A monitoring report that fell through? An alert that was meant to be sent and wasn't? The kind of catastrophic procedural gap that required no malice at all, only the ordinary failures of a system under pressure? Or had someone looked at the cost of a source closure? The disruption, the political friction of issuing a downstream alert into Halvari territory, the acknowledgement of Iron Reach culpability, and decided the cost was too high. She didn't know. What she knew was the name on the second notation, the one that said reviewed, monitoring assigned. She had read it 3 times to be certain. She did not recognize it. It was not Zuran's. That should have been a relief. It was not nothing. She filed it carefully, held it separate from the parts she was still uncertain about. But the file itself existed within Iron Reach's administrative system. Someone above the level of a routine inspector would have had access to it. Oversight existed for exactly these situations, which meant either the failure had been invisible to that oversight, or the oversight had not been looking. She could not yet determine which. She returned the file to its place with the same precision with which she had removed it. She straightened the surrounding files. She left the archive the way she had entered it, quietly, without drama, latching the door behind her. In the corridor she stopped and stood still for a moment. There was a particular weight that came with knowing something that required action, but not yet knowing what action was right. She had carried it before. It did not get easier with familiarity. She had not come to Iron Reach to protect someone guilty. She had been clear with herself about that from the beginning. It was the condition under which she had agreed, privately, to give whatever she found a fair hearing before deciding what to do with it. she had also not come to destroy someone innocent. A buried report and an incomplete monitoring order were evidence of something. They were not yet evidence of enough. She needed the name. She needed to know who had assigned the monitoring and why the record stopped. She needed more. She walked back toward the eastern wing, her expression giving nothing away, her mind already moving through the next steps with the quiet, methodical focus of a woman who had learned long ago that the most dangerous thing she could do was stop thinking clearly at exactly the moment when clarity was most difficult to maintain. Chapter 5. It was the archivist who told him. Not out of malice. The man was not built for malice. He told tale the way people tell things when they are uncertain whether something is a problem and have decided that uncertainty is someone else's job. He mentioned it at the end of a routine administrative exchange, almost as an afterthought, in the careful tone of a man who wanted to have reported it without being responsible for what happened next. A woman matching Fane's description had been seen leaving the eastern administrative corridor at a time when the archive would have been unattended. The latch had been disturbed. Nothing appeared to be missing, but the water source files for the southern border had been moved, returned, but moved. The archivist could tell. He had organized that system for 11 years, and he knew where everything sat. Tyle thanked him, kept his expression neutral, and went directly to Zuran. He found the king in the war room, standing over a territorial map with 2 of his border commanders. Tyle waited at the door. Zuran glanced at him once, read something in his stillness, and dismissed the commanders without explanation. The door closed. Tyle told him everything. He was precise about it. The archivist's account, the timing, the specific file that had been accessed. He did not editorialize. He had learned over 12 years that Zuran's decisions were better when the information arrived clean. When he finished, the room was quiet. Zuran had not moved from the map. He was looking at it, or appearing to. Tyle had seen that particular quality of attention before, and knew it meant the map was not what he was seeing. "How long was she in there?" Zuran said. Based on the archivist's timing, less than 30 minutes. A pause. "Did she take anything?" "No. Everything was returned." Zuran said nothing for long enough that Tyle began constructing his own recommendation. Increased surveillance, a formal confrontation, notification to the Halvari Packmaster that their representative had exceeded the boundaries of her diplomatic role. Any of these responses would have been defensible. He was prepared to present them. "Let her keep looking," Zuran said. Tyle absorbed this. "She's investigating us." "I know. She entered a restricted archive without authorization." "I know." Zuran's voice was not sharp. That was the thing about it. It was never sharp. It had a quality of flatness that was more final than anger, the tone of a man who had already moved past the point where argument was useful. "Let her keep looking." Tyle looked at him for a moment. He was not a man who pushed, generally. He had learned when pushing was worthwhile, and when it wasn't, and he had learned to tell the difference by watching what Zuran's face did when a question arrived. Right now, Zuran's face was doing the thing it did when he had already decided, and the decision was not one he intended to explain. "Understood," Tyle said. He left. Zuran waited until the footsteps faded completely before he moved. He went to the cabinet on the far wall, iron-faced, deep, stacked with territorial records and administrative correspondence that he reviewed personally rather than delegating, because there were categories of information he did not trust to travel through too many hands. He knew where everything in it was. He did not need to search. The file was near the back. He had placed it there 9 months ago after pulling it from the administrative records himself, quietly, without explanation. in a way that would look like routine review to anyone who noticed and mean nothing to anyone who didn't. He carried it to the table and opened it. He had read it enough times that the pages fell open naturally. The water source management assessment for the southern border channel. The inspector's flag, upstream contamination indicators detected. Recommend immediate source closure and downstream alert. The second notation 4 days later. Reviewed, monitoring assigned. Further action pending assessment. And then nothing. He had found this 9 months ago while reviewing a separate administrative dispute about the southern border territory. A land measurement discrepancy that had seemed minor until it led him to a pattern of small irregularities, each individually explainable, collectively suggesting that someone with access to Iron Reach's administrative records had been making quiet adjustments for some time. The water source file had been one thread among several. The most troubling thread, because its consequences were not administrative. He had not been able to identify who had added the second notation. The handwriting did not match any of the 3 officials whose signatures appeared on routine southern border paperwork. He had requested a comparison quietly, through channels he trusted, and the comparison had produced nothing. Either the handwriting was deliberately altered, or it belonged to someone whose writing was not in his reference set. He had been pulling threads since then, carefully, without alerting whoever was at the other end, because the moment they knew he was looking, the threads would disappear. He had not found the name. He looked at the file in front of him, and thought about a woman who had arrived on foot with a dull knife and accessed his restricted archive in under 30 minutes and taken nothing, which meant she had found what she came for and was still deciding what to do with it. She had come to Iron Reach for this, not as a diplomatic gesture, not as Halvari's expendable representative. She had engineered her own assignment and used it to get inside these walls, which meant she had been investigating from the Halvari side for longer than he had been investigating from his, which meant she might have threads he didn't. He had 2 choices. He could treat her as a threat, contain her, restrict her access, send her back to Halvari with a formal complaint, and lose whatever she had found. Or he could let her keep pulling and see where her threads led. He was not certain she was trustworthy. He was not certain she was not. What he was certain of was that 17 people were dead, and in 9 months of careful, quiet investigation, he had not been able to find the person responsible, and Fane had been at Iron Reach for less than a week and had already found the same file he had. He closed the folder. He sat with the weight of the decision he had already made in the war room, the one he hadn't explained to Tail, because some things needed to be carried alone until they didn't. Let her keep looking. He would watch where she went. Chapter 6. It took her 3 more days. Not because the information was difficult to find, because she needed to find it correctly. There was a difference between knowing something and being able to stand behind what you knew without it collapsing under the weight of scrutiny. Fane had learned that early. In medicine, a diagnosis reached too quickly was more dangerous than no diagnosis at all. It gave you confidence in the wrong direction. So she was methodical. She went back to the archive twice more, during the midday hour when the corridor traffic was lowest, and she worked through the southern border administrative correspondence in the way she worked through a patient's history. Chronologically, looking for the shape of things, not just the individual facts. The shape, when it emerged, was not what she had expected. She had expected negligence, a missed flag, an overwhelmed administrator, a monitoring task assigned to someone who deprioritized it and never followed up. These things happened. Systems failed through inattention as often as through intention, and she had trained herself not to assume malice when incompetence was sufficient explanation. But the correspondence didn't read like inattention. It read like management. The second notation on the flagged report, reviewed, monitoring assigned, further action pending assessment, had been added by hand to a typed document. She had noted this before. What she had not been able to determine on her previous visits was whose hand. On the third visit, she found it. A routine Southern Border administrative memo from 11 months ago, buried in a correspondence folder between 2 land survey reports. It was a minor document, a note about adjusted maintenance schedules for the Southern Channel infrastructure, unremarkable in every way except that the handwriting in the margin annotation matched the second notation on the flagged report with a precision that required no expert analysis. She sat very still for a moment. At the bottom of the memo, a signature. Kreth, Territorial Warden, Southern Border Administration. She read it twice. Then she folded the information away inside herself, replaced the memo exactly as she had found it, and left the archive. The young archivist was easier than she had anticipated. He was perhaps 20, with the eager helpfulness of someone who had not yet learned that information was currency and should be spent carefully. Fane found him in the outer records room that afternoon, reorganizing a shelf of land survey maps, and approached him with the specific quality of unhurried friendliness she reserved for conversations that needed to feel accidental. She asked about the survey maps first, genuinely curious questions about the southern border territory, the kind of topographical detail a healer might reasonably want for understanding water drainage patterns. He was pleased to help. He knew the maps well. He talked. She listened and guided and waited. When she mentioned the Southern Border Warden's office in passing, framed as a logistical question about who managed infrastructure maintenance in that area, he answered without hesitation. Warden Kreth, he said. 16 years with Iron Reach administration. The longest-serving territorial warden currently active. Knew the southern border better than anyone. She nodded. Asked, with the mild curiosity of someone making conversation, whether the warden's office handled land transactions as well as infrastructure. The young archivist's expression shifted. Not suspicion. Something more like the particular animation of someone who had an interesting piece of information and had been waiting for an excuse to share it. He lowered his voice by a fraction, which, in Fane's experience, meant the information was considered notable but not officially sensitive. Warden Kreth had been acquiring land, he said, quietly, through intermediaries, over the past 2 years. Not Iron Reach land. Border-adjacent parcels on the neutral strip between Iron Reach and Halvari territory. Small acquisitions individually, significant in aggregate. The kind of holdings that would be worth very little under normal diplomatic conditions, and considerably more if the relationship between the 2 territories deteriorated, if trade routes shifted, if border access became restricted, if neutral land suddenly became strategically valuable to both sides, and neither could formally claim it. Fane kept her expression pleasantly interested. She thanked him, made a comment about the maps that made him smile, and walked away. She sat in her room for a long time that evening. The candle burned. Outside, the stronghold settled into its nighttime sounds. She sat at the table with her hands flat on the surface in front of her, and worked through it the way she worked through everything, without rushing, without letting what she felt about it contaminate what she knew. Kreth had not caused the contagion. She was clear on that. The contamination at the water source had been a natural failure of aging border infrastructure, the kind of gradual degradation that inspection was designed to catch. The inspector had caught it. The flag had been accurate, and the recommendation had been correct. Kreth had seen it. He had reviewed the flag, understood what it meant, and made a calculation. A source closure would have required Ironreach to issue a downstream alert into Halvari territory, an acknowledgement of culpability, a diplomatic friction point, a moment of demonstrated Ironreach responsibility for Halvari welfare. It would have cost him nothing personally. It would have cost his land investments everything. Deteriorating relations between the two territories were the engine of their value. So he had assigned monitoring. He had left the file open. He had let the infrastructure continue to fail, and trusted that by the time the consequences arrived, they would arrive on the Halvari side of the line and look like the ordinary cost of living near a border. 17 people. He had known they were at risk. He had known, and he had decided that his land holdings were worth more than the downstream alert that would have warned them. Fane pressed her fingers against the table until the pressure was something she could focus on. She had carried this question for 14 months. She had carried the faces of the people she hadn't saved, and the weight of not knowing whether it could have been prevented, and by whom. Now she knew. She stood, put on her coat, and walked through the corridor toward the war room with the particular quality of stillness that was not calm, but its close, functional neighbor, the steadiness of someone who has decided what comes next and is no longer deliberating. She was going to find Zuran, not because she had decided to trust him, because the truth belonged to him, and she was finished carrying it alone. Chapter 7. The war room was lit by 3 candles, and the last of the fire when she arrived. Zuran was alone. He was standing at the far side of the room with a document in his hand, reading, and he did not startle when the door opened. He turned with the unhurried steadiness of a man who had long ago made peace with the fact that something was always coming, and startling accomplished nothing. He looked at her face. He set the document down. Fane did not sit. She stood in the middle of the room and told him everything from the beginning, not from her arrival at Ironreach, but from Wren's Crossing 14 months ago. The first cases, the progression, the 17 dead, her return afterward and the investigation that followed, the contamination markers at the water source, the sealed record she had carried across 2 territories on foot when her escort abandoned her. She told him about the archive. She did not apologize for entering it without authorization, and he did not ask her to. She told him about the flagged report, the second notation, the handwriting comparison, the young archivist and the land transactions, and the quiet accumulation of border-adjacent parcels whose value depended entirely on diplomatic deterioration between 2 packs. She told him Kreth's name. She said it plainly, the way she said everything, without drama, without softening, without watching his face to calibrate how much he could handle. The truth was the truth. It did not require presentation. Throughout all of it, Zuran did not speak. He stood on the other side of the room and listened with the complete attention of a man who had learned that interrupting was how you heard what you expected rather than what was actually being said. His expression did not change in the ways expressions usually change when people received difficult information. No visible shock, no defensive tightening. He simply absorbed it, each piece in order. When she finished, the fire had burned down another inch. The silence lasted long enough that a different kind of person might have filled it. Fane did not. She had said what she came to say, and she was prepared to wait. "Why didn't you take this to your pack, Master?" Zuran said finally, "and let him use it politically?" She had known a question was coming. She had not known which one. This one landed in a specific place, not because it was accusatory, but because it was precise. It was the question that went to the center of everything, the one that required her to say out loud what she had only ever said to herself. She considered, for a fraction of a second, giving him the version that was easier. The professional answer, that she had wanted to verify the evidence before it became a diplomatic instrument, that unverified information caused more damage than none. All of that was true. She did not say it. "Because people died," she said. "That's not a negotiating position. That's a debt." The room was very quiet. Something moved across Zoran's face, not an expression she had seen on him before, and she had been watching him more carefully than he probably realized. It was not softening. Softening implied a previous hardness, and she had never read him as hard, exactly. Contained, yes. Restrained, yes. But not hard in the way that indicated absence of feeling. What moved across his face was recognition, the particular quality of it that arrived when something outside yourself reflects something you already knew was true and had not said aloud. He crossed to the cabinet on the far wall. She watched him open it, reach toward the back without searching, and remove a file. He carried it to the table between them and set it down. She looked at it, then at him. 9 months ago, he said. "I found the flagged report during a review of Southern Border administrative records. The second notation, the handwriting didn't match any signature on file. I requested a comparison through channels I trusted and came back with nothing." He opened the file. The flagged report was inside, along with a series of documents she hadn't seen: land registry cross-references, administrative access logs, a map of the southern border with notations in Zoran's own hand marking the parcels she now knew belonged to Kreth's intermediaries. "I've been building toward his name for months. I had the pattern. I didn't have the signature." Fane looked at the documents. Her sealed medical record had the signature. His administrative investigation had the pattern. Separately, each was suggestive. Together, they were complete. She pulled her satchel from her shoulder, removed the oilcloth-wrapped record, and set it on the table beside his file. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "You knew something was wrong on your territory," she said. Not an accusation, a fact being confirmed. "I knew something had been mishandaged," he said. "I didn't know the cost of it until now." He looked at the sealed record. 17. 17, she said. He was quiet with that for a moment, in the way she had learned meant he was not avoiding it, but carrying it, actually taking the weight of it rather than managing his response to it. She had met very few people who did that. Most people, when confronted with the human cost of something that happened on their watch, moved quickly to what they had or hadn't known, to the distance between themselves and the failure. Zoran didn't move. He stayed with it. It was the first time since her arrival that she felt something shift in how she held him. Not trust, not yet, but the precondition of it. The recognition that he was not going to make this smaller than it was. "The land registry records I have," he said, "combined with your contamination evidence and the signature match. That's enough for a formal proceeding before the full pack council. Kreth can't argue against the pattern and the physical evidence together." "How long?" Fane said. "Days. Not weeks." She nodded once. They stood on either side of the table with the two files between them. His months of careful, quiet investigation and her 14 months of carried weight arrived at the same point from opposite directions, neither of them having known the other was pulling the same thread. There was something almost architectural about it. Two load-bearing walls built independently, discovering they were holding up the same structure. Zoran looked at her across the table. "You should have told me sooner," he said. Not recriminating, honest. "I didn't know if you were the someone," she said. Equally honest. He accepted that with a single nod. Outside, the fire died down to embers. Neither of them moved to add wood. The dark settled around the edges of the room, and inside it 2 people who had each been carrying something alone stood in the specific quiet of people who no longer had to. Chapter 8. Creth had survived 16 years in Ironreach administration by understanding one thing above all others. Information moved before people did. He had built his entire career on that principle, on knowing what was happening in a room before he entered it, on reading the small signals that preceded large shifts, on positioning himself ahead of consequences rather than beneath them. It had made him valuable. It had made him trusted. It had made him, over the course of 16 careful years, nearly invisible in the way that administrators become invisible when they are consistently useful and never inconvenient. He had been watching Fane since the morning after her arrival. Not obviously. He had not survived this long by being obvious. He watched the way he always watched, through the ordinary movements of a man doing his job, present in corridors and administrative rooms for reasons that required no explanation, attentive in the way that looked like nothing more than professional diligence. He had watched her catalogue the Eastern Wall. He had watched her argue with the king at the formal dinner, heard the tone of it through the door, the particular back and forth of 2 people who were not performing for each other. He had watched Tael pull her file and come back empty. He had noted when the archivist became agitated, and when he subsequently settled, which meant someone had told him to settle. And this morning he had watched Fane and Zuren leave the war room together. They had been inside for 2 hours. Zuren had entered first, and Fane had followed 20 minutes later. When they emerged, they were not speaking, but it was not the silence of people who had nothing to say. It was the silence of people who had finished saying something significant and were still inside the weight of it. Zuren's face gave nothing away. It never did. But Fane's satchel, which she had carried into the war room, was lighter when she came out. Creth walked back to his office at a normal pace. He sat at his desk. He looked at the wall for a measured amount of time. Then he reached for paper and began to write. The formal complaint arrived at Tael's office by mid-morning. Tael read it once, set it down, and read it again with the particular attention of someone who wanted to be certain he had understood correctly before deciding how to respond. Warden Creth, territorial administrator for the southern border, formally alleged that the Halvari diplomatic representative, referred to throughout by her full role rather than her name, a detail Tael noted, had gained unauthorized access to the Ironreach Medical Archive on multiple occasions and had removed sensitive administrative documents relating to southern border water source management. The complaint was precisely worded. It cited the correct administrative statutes. It requested formal investigation and immediate restriction of the representative's movement within the stronghold pending that investigation. It was signed and dated with the practiced confidence of a man who had written official documents for 16 years. Tael brought it to Zuren without comment. Zuren read it, set it on the table. "Pull the archivists," he said, "all 3 of them, separately." The interviews took less than 2 hours. The senior archivist, the one who had twice refused Fane's access request and subsequently noticed the disturbed files, confirmed that on each occasion he had checked the archive after Fane's visits. Every document had been present and in its correct location. He was precise about this. He had organized that system for 11 years, and he knew where everything was. The second archivist, who managed the correspondence files, said the same. He had audited the southern border administrative records himself the previous week, as part of routine monthly verification. Nothing was missing. Nothing was misplaced. The young archivist, when asked, went slightly pale, not from guilt, but from the particular alarm of someone who suddenly understood that a conversation he had considered casual had been something else, entirely. He confirmed that Fane had never entered the archive in his presence, and had never to his knowledge, removed anything from it. He was asked whether he had discussed archive contents with her. He said yes, and told them what they had discussed, which was land survey geography and administrative structure. His account was consistent. His distress was genuine. 3 separate confirmations. No removed documents. Tyle compiled the results and brought them to Zuren, who looked at them for a long moment. "Send the response to Kreth's office," Zuren said. "Copy the Pack Council." Kreth received the response at midday. He read it standing at his desk, which was unusual. He was a man who sat to read documents, who treated careful posture as part of careful thinking. He read it standing because he had seen Tyle's expression when the messenger delivered it, and had understood before he opened it that the ground had already moved. The response was brief. The formal complaint had been investigated. 3 independent witnesses confirmed no documents had been removed from the archive. The complaint was found to be without evidentiary basis. The final line noted that the complaint itself and the circumstances of its submission had been forwarded to the full Pack Council for review. Kreth set the document on his desk. He had known, filing the complaint, that it required the archivists to have no memory of Fane's access, or to be unwilling to contradict a 16-year warden's formal statement. He had calculated the odds as acceptable. He had been wrong, which meant his calculation had been based on the assumption that the archive visits were less documented than they were. He had not accounted for a woman who replaced every document she touched. They came for him before evening, not with spectacle. That was the thing that would stay with the people who witnessed it. There was no raised voice, no dramatic confrontation in the great hall. Tyle arrived at the Southern Border Administrative Office with 4 sentinels and a formal detention order bearing Zuren's seal, and Kreth was escorted from the building and into holding with the quiet efficiency of a process that had been prepared in advance. His office was sealed. His administrative access was revoked. The land registry documents, the contamination evidence, and the signed medical record were packaged formally and delivered to the Pack Council chambers before nightfall. 16 years of careful invisibility ended in an afternoon. Not by force, not by spectacle, by 3 archivists who knew exactly where everything was, and a woman who had never once taken what wasn't hers to take. Chapter 9. The Pack Council had taken the evidence without visible surprise, which meant they had suspected something for longer than they had acted on it, which was a thing Fane decided not to spend energy on. Institutions protected themselves. That was not new information. What mattered was that the proceeding was formally opened. What mattered was that the record existed now in the kind of official permanence that couldn't be quietly buried in an administrative folder and left to mean nothing. What mattered was that 17 people had a named reason, and the name was attached to consequences. She had done what she came to do. She began to pack that evening. It did not take long. She had never fully unpacked. The satchel had remained the organizational center of her belongings, everything else arranged around it, in the provisional way of someone who had never quite committed to being in a place. Her medicines went in first. The oilcloth wrapping, now empty of the sealed record, folded and stored from habit. Her spare clothes, her field kit, the small knife she had finally sharpened, on a stone she borrowed from the kitchen, without asking and returned without comment. She moved through it methodically, the way she moved through most things. It was only when she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the packed satchel that she noticed the room had become, at some point between her arrival and now, less cold than it had been. She hadn't added anything to it. Nothing had changed about the stone walls or the single window, or the functional absence of comfort, but something in the quality of the space had shifted. And she sat with that for a moment before deciding not to examine it too carefully. She was good at not examining things too carefully when examining them would not change what she's had already decided. She lay down without undressing and looked at the ceiling. The knock came late, not tentative. Nothing about Zuren was tentative, but measured. The knock of a man who had decided to be somewhere and was announcing himself rather than asking permission. "Come in," she said. He looked at the packed satchel on the table. He looked at her. He did not comment on either. He sat in the chair by the window, the only chair which she had never used, with the particular quality of a man who intended to stay for a specific amount of time and had not decided yet how long that was. Outside the window, the sky was the deep blue-black of late evening. A wind had come up. She could hear it finding the gaps in the stone. For a while, neither of them spoke. It was not uncomfortable. That was the thing she had noticed about silence with him. It had never been uncomfortable. Not since the formal dinner, not since the war room. It was the silence of two people who had stopped performing, which meant there was nothing to fill. "The council will take 3 weeks minimum," he said, "possibly more. I know. You don't need to be here for it. I know that too." He looked at the window. The wind moved against the glass. "Who taught you to do it like that?" he said. Not a complete question, but she understood it. Do what? Hold everything. Without, he stopped, considered, without letting it show that you're holding it. She was quiet for a moment. It was not a question she had been asked before, which was either because no one had noticed or because no one had thought it required explanation. She wasn't certain which was worse. "No one taught me," she said. "It was more that I noticed early that when things fell apart, someone had to stay functional, and I was usually available for that." "Available," he repeated. "It's useful," she said, "until it isn't." He turned from the window and looked at her directly. "When isn't it?" She considered giving him the deflecting answer, the professional framing, the observed in others version that kept the conversation at a remove. She had a number of those ready. She used them often. "When you've been the person who stays functional for long enough that people stop checking whether you are," she said, "because the assumption is structural at that point. You're load-bearing. Load-bearing things don't get asked if they're tired." The room was very quiet. Zuren looked at her with the expression she had seen once before, in the war room, when she had said that's a debt, not a negotiating position. Recognition. The specific kind that meant the thing being recognized was not abstract. 9 years, he said, not explaining, placing something on the table between them. "I know," she said. "It becomes." He stopped again. He was not a man who struggled for words generally. When he stopped, it was because the word he needed was one he didn't use often, and he was deciding whether to use it now. It becomes the only mode available. After a while you stop noticing there were others. "Yes," she said, "just that." Yes, because it was true, and it was enough, and adding to it would have made it smaller. They sat in the room together, with the wind outside and the candle burning low on the table beside the packed satchel. Two people who had spent years being what their circumstances required, and had gotten very good at it, and had not, until recently, been in a room with someone who understood that from the inside, rather than the outside, he did not ask her to stay. She had understood by now that asking was not something that came naturally to him, not from arrogance, but from the long calcification of a man who had learned early that needing things made you manageable, and had protected himself accordingly, and had done it for so long that the protection had become indistinguishable from his actual architecture. He did not ask. He stayed until the candle had burned most of the way down. Then he stood and looked at her once more with that expression she didn't quite have a name for, and left. Fane looked at the packed satchel on the table for a long time. She did not unpack it. She did not set her boots by the door the way she did on nights before early departures. Outside, the wind continued. The stronghold settled into its deep nighttime quiet. The candle burned down to nothing, and the room went dark, and she lay in it without sleeping, not deciding anything, simply existing in the space between what she had planned and what she had not yet chosen. Morning came, she was still there. Chapter 10, he asked her on the third day. Not the morning after. He had sat in her room until the candle died. Not the following day. And Nifed's. Niced, when they had passed each other in the Eastern corridor and exchanged the particular nod of two people carrying an unfinished conversation and choosing not to finish it in a hallway. On the third day he came to find her in the small courtyard off the kitchen wing, where she had taken to spending her mornings, cataloguing the late-season growth along the drainage wall with focused attention. She gave everything that required close observation. He stood at the courtyard entrance for a moment. She did not look up, but she knew he was there. "Stay," he said, one word. No architecture around it, no qualification, no political framing, just the word, plain, the way she said things, stripped of everything except what it actually was. She looked up then. He was standing in the entrance, with the winter light behind him, and the expression of a man who had just done something that cost him considerably and was not going to pretend otherwise. It was the most unguarded she had seen him. She understood what it had taken to get there. 9 years of calcified self-sufficiency, the long habit of never naming what he needed, broken open in a single syllable. She looked at him for a long moment. "On what terms?" she said. Something in him settled, not relief exactly, but the easing of a specific tension. He had asked. She had not said no. They were negotiating, which meant they were already past the part that had cost him the most. "Your terms," he said. "Tell me what they are," she told him. It took longer than one word. The Halvari Packmaster's response arrived 6 days later. It was 3 paragraphs of diplomatic language that translated, when stripped of its formal courtesy, to profound confusion. The Packmaster had sent Fane to Ironreach as an expendable representative, and she had somehow ended the diplomatic tension between 2 territories, exposed a 16-year administrative conspiracy, and arranged her own indefinite residencies in the most fortified stronghold on the continent. Apparently of her own volition, and on her own terms. He did not know how to categorize this outcome. His letter did not say so directly, but the careful neutrality of its language said it for him. He offered no objection. There was nothing, technically, to object to. Fane was not bonded to Halvari territory. She owed no formal allegiance beyond her healer's designation, which she retained. She had broken no protocol and violated no treaty. She had simply stayed. He wished her well with the particular warmth of a man who had decided the wisest response to something he didn't understand was to appear as though he had intended it all along. Fane read the letter once, set it aside, and went back to work. The Ironreach Council was a different matter. They did not object loudly. Objecting loudly to Zuran was not something the Council had managed in 9 years, and they were not going to begin now. But they objected in the way councils object, when they lack both the authority and the courage for directness. Through procedural questions, through requests for formal clarification, through the careful suggestion that perhaps the king might wish to define the nature of the arrangement for administrative purposes. Zuran's formal statement to the council was characteristically brief. Fane would be remaining at Ironreach. She had agreed to serve as senior field healer for the border territories, with autonomous authority over medical decisions in her designated regions and direct reporting access to the king's office. She was not a diplomatic representative. She was not a political appointment. She was a healer of significant competence who had chosen to be here, and she had been asked to stay by someone with the authority to ask. The council waited for more. There was no more. One of the senior council members asked, with diplomatic delicacy, whether there was an intended formal designation, a title, a role within the existing hierarchy that the council might use for official correspondence purposes. Zuran looked at him. "Her name," he said, "is Fane." The meeting ended shortly after. The weeks that followed had a texture that was new to both of them. Not uncomplicated. Nothing about two people who were each constitutionally resistant to accommodation suddenly sharing a life was uncomplicated. There were adjustments. There were conversations that were harder than either of them expected, and shorter than they should have been, and returned to later, with more honesty than the first attempt had managed. Fane worked. She mapped the border medical infrastructure with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had inherited a neglected system and intended to understand it completely before changing anything. She sent supply requests through official channels and went around them when the channels were too slow and apologized for neither. She was difficult in precisely the ways she had always been difficult, which was to say, she was consistently, inconveniently right. Zuran governed. He was precisely the same man he had always been, measured, restrained, the kind of steady that had nothing to do with ease. But something in the architecture had shifted, in the way she had described. A load-bearing thing, held alone for 9 years, incrementally redistributed, not dependent, not softened, simply no longer entirely alone inside the weight of itself. Neither of them remarked on it directly. They didn't need to. She came back from the border run on a Tuesday. 7 days in the outer settlements, 2 of them in weather that had turned mean, 1 long night setting a young sentinel's badly broken arm in a farmhouse, with no proper light and instruments she had to improvise. She was tired in the way that went into the bones. Her coat had rode dust on the shoulders. Her boots had done another week's work, on top of all the previous week's work, which was beginning to show. She walked through the eastern gate and across the outer yard and into the great hall with the same quality she had always moved, like she had already decided she belonged and was simply confirming. The hall was occupied. A territorial meeting, 3-pack representatives, Tail and 2 commanders arranged around the long table with maps between them. Every head turned. The bootlace, the left one, the same one, break time 05s, the one that had been losing its structural integrity for the better part of a year, finally gave up entirely and came loose, dragging across the stone as she walked. She didn't break stride. Zuran was already moving. She heard it before she saw it. The particular quality of footsteps that belonged to a man crossing a room with purpose. And by the time he reached her, she had already stopped walking and turned to face him. He crouched, tied the lace with the same thorough efficiency as the first time, stood. The difference was that this time she was already watching him when he rose, and this time, break time 05s, when the surprise moved across her face, the same surprise she had sealed away 14 months ago in a room full of strangers. She let it stay. She let him see it, all of it. The warmth she didn't perform, and the tiredness she didn't hide, and something beneath both of those that didn't have a clean name, but lived in the specific territory between recognition and gratitude, and the particular relief of being seen by someone who was paying attention because they wanted to, not because it was required of them. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had learned, over weeks of careful observation, to read correctly. He was not unmoved. He turned and walked back toward the table. She adjusted the strap of her satchel and continued across the hall toward the eastern corridor. Behind her, the territorial meeting resumed. Maps were consulted, decisions were made. The ordinary weight of governing a territory settled back into the room, and nobody in that hall, not the pack representatives, not the commanders, not Tail, who had seen more than most, said a single word about what had just happened, because some things don't require words. Some things are simply, finally true. This is a story about two people who had spent so long being what their circumstances required that they had forgotten to account for what they actually needed. Fane carried 17 names across 2 territories on foot, because she believed that the dead deserved a named reason and someone willing to find it. Zuran held a buried report for 9 months in Sussex, because he understood that justice handled carelessly becomes something else entirely. Neither of them set out to find the other. They simply arrived at the same truth from opposite directions and had the rare honesty to admit they couldn't finish it alone. The kneeling was never about power. It was never about reverence or dominance or the grand gestures that stories are supposed to be built on. It was one person noticing a small thing that mattered to someone who had stopped expecting to be noticed. That is the whole of it. That is also, quietly, everything. Some debts are owed to the dead. Some are owed to the living. Break time 05s, the hardest ones to pay, are the ones we owe to ourselves. The permission to stop carrying alone what was never meant to be carried alone. Fane and Zuran paid theirs, slowly, imperfectly, on their own terms. That is the only way it ever actually works. If this story stayed with you, if you felt every chapter, every silence, every moment that didn't need words, then you already know what to do. Hit subscribe and stay with us. Thank you, and I will see you in my next one.